Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to see a full pre-concert, talk crowd. I'm sure you're here make sure you're here for the right concert. We have we have Benjamin Beilman, violin, and Steven Osborne, pianist, and I'm very excited. This has been a long time, waiting for a long time for this to happen. So we're very pleased to have them here. So please join me in welcoming them. We've had a fun couple of days. They've been playing together and just rehearsing. It's always one of my greatest pleasures just to get to sit and listen a bit. And one of the things, I thought we could maybe just start with, you tried out the Chrysler violin. I was just curious what you thought of it, because it does have a particular relationship to your violin.
Sure. As you all must know, the Library of Congress often will loan out some of their instruments from the collection for performers to use. Sometimes in those cases, I don't know where the Chrysler is currently, but Chrysler for me is a musical hero. He's to me the embodiment of what we should all aspire to be as musicians. He was obviously a great fiddler. He was a composer. He was an arranger. He was a humanitarian. He would devote many of his concert fees to orphanages and great causes. And also he had great taste in fiddles. So this violin that's currently here since 1952, everybody that I talk to who has played on this concert stage basically says, you must try this violin. If you only have time for one, you have to try it. It is, words escape me in terms of describing what's possible with it. It's powerful, but not punching you in the mouth. It's colorful. It can be silky sweet. It can be incredibly nuanced. It can do basically everything. I was very tempted to try and play it on the first half of tonight's concert, but after playing on it for a few hours, it sort of felt like this is a stallion that I don't quite have grips over just yet. And the Mr. Chrysler and Mr. Izai, the kind of namesake of my violin, they had a lot of connections themselves, supposedly. I don't know if this is true, but I think it might be. When Fritz Chrysler made his debut with the Berlin Philharmonic, or the kind of earlier version of the Philharmonic, apparently the night before he had been out gambling, as he was very frequently doing. He had wagered his violin, lost the violin, and then basically went to his mentor, Izai, who was in Berlin at the time, and he says, Maestro, can you help me? And so Izai loaned him a violin. I don't know if it was the violin that I currently play or probably a different one. But anyway, they were very close friends. Izai, he wasn't a teacher of Chrysler's, but he was a inspirational figure. He was known as the czar of the violin. So all the violinists of Chrysler's generation would have looked up to Izai. But yeah, so I could go on about Chrysler and about the violin, but yeah, it was a joy to taste what Mr. Chrysler had in his hands briefly.
Well, thanks for doing that, just because it's always it's nice to have a chance for the instruments themselves to get played and stuff by visiting artists and stuff. And Steven, we very briefly just had a moment with George Gershwin's piano in the Gershwin room. What did you think of? You had like 2 minutes to figure, but.
Oh, it's beautiful. These old style pianos, which weren't built so much with this really strong projection, they're beautiful to play. Like, they're easy to play, colorful. It's an amazing thing to sort of touch history like that. I remember the first time I played a piano that had a connection with history at my piano teacher's house, and she said, "Oh, Brendel was here 2 weeks ago practicing." I'm touching the same keys Brendel touched, but how better, well, not maybe not better, but how amazing to have the same thing with Gershwin. That was lovely.
Well, no, thank you for that. I like that. The osmosis kind of like technique of, I think maybe it would be best to just kind of talk through this program, because it's a really beautiful program, and I think it really works together well. And I guess we'd start with, at the beginning, we're looking at the Clara Schumann romances, dating from, I think, 1853, which is kind of a tricky period for her, with Robert Schumann and his mental illness kind of coming to the fore around that time as well. But she was no stranger to the romance as she had multiple piano romances before that. And but what drew you to these? These are the only violin romances I think she wrote. I think that's correct. What drew you to these pieces and to program?
jump in if I'm missing something. So Steven and I, we knew that we wanted to have, the Brahms G major sonata as kind of one of the big anchors, and selfishly, the Franck sonata, which we'll mention a little bit about the history later. There's a personal connection to my violin. And so we were thinking, okay, we have these two, a Franco-Belgian war horse, and we have this German kind of desert island sonata. And of course, it immediately struck me, I think at the time I was probably en route to Philadelphia to teach at Curtis. And I was thinking about all the various influences and teachers and how these lineages affect all the composers and how we're all influenced by this teacher idea. So Clara Schumann was obviously a dear friend, an editor, a mentor also to Johannes Brahms. And in the second half, Lili Boulanger was sort of a direct descendant and beneficiary of Franck's time at the Paris Conservatoire. So the Clara Schumann romances, I think specifically were your suggestion for this. Is that right?
Was it? I don't remember now. It's funny. I find program planning really interesting and satisfying, and I work quite hard at it because it's not difficult to throw a bunch of pieces together, but to get a program where there is both a kind of musical line, emotional line that goes through it, but also the kind of connections that Ben's talking about can be very satisfying. And so Ben and I have only worked a few times together before, but when we were planning this program, I was very struck how he was thinking very much along. He was very concerned also with this sense of a program has to be coherent. You don't want to have steak for your starter and then have tiramisu and then have chicken soup. It's like, so trying to find something that really feels like it coheres and so it's really satisfying to listen to. So it's not about Clara Schumann, but I don't know if you thought of that.
Well, it's another really, it's an interesting moment because at that point, Clara Schumann had written potentially more than Johannes Brahms had, because Brahms was about 20, 21 maybe when she wrote these pieces. And of course, Brahms had written a lot at that point that he had it was just emerging with his first piano sonatas and scherzo and stuff like that he played for Clara and Robert. But he wasn't yet the Brahms of the G major, violin sonata. So it's kind of this looking, I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about it in those terms, that where she was in terms of her mastery at that moment. And I think there are a lot of interesting things that kind of come through. And of course, if you study their music together, there's lots of connections that they had also with Robert Schumann as well. But maybe just going on to that more mature Brahms, when he does write the first violin sonata, which was maybe not the first, but the fifth or sixth or whatever it is, that sometimes I wonder if he was adding numbers to this. I don't know. But yeah, tell me about this. Is to me, you mentioned it as a desert island piece, but that's kind of how I feel about it too. If you mean like just one of these kind of perfect violin sonatas in many ways. I hate to say that, but I kind of have to say it.
Well, I should mention another direct influence. So obviously, Brahms spent a lot of time in the Schumann house, studying with Robert Schumann, also getting coached by Clara Schumann. He grew attached to the family. The Schumanns had 7 children. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Brahms wrote this sonata, and especially the second movement, in a kind of reflection on one of the Schumann children passing. Felix, I think, was 24, and he died probably of tuberculosis. You'll hear the second movement is a sort of, it begins with an adieu, and it's a farewell of sorts. It's not dour, it's not tragic, but it has a kind of, go in peace sense to it. And then the finale of it is a quote from one of Brahms' own songs, the Reagan Lied, the raindrops, basically. And there's the kind of companion piece. I think it's in English, it's called Remembrance. So I think this idea that he was close to the Schumann family was soaking through him. And so that sense of the next world or immortality or mortality, I think, contributes to the sense of, he wants to write timeless music. It starts with a G major chord or a set of G major chords in the piano part that just sort of feel like, I don't know, firstly resonance. I don't know how you think of this, but to me, it somehow feels, he wrote this when he was in Switzerland, walking along the lakes and stuff. So the sense of nature and eternity, I think, was in his mind.
apparently Brahms said it must have been wonderful to live in Mozart's time when composing was so much easier. So he felt so much the weight of Beethoven's shadow on him, and like, how on earth do you compose music after the greatness of this? And early in his career, there was a wonderful spontaneity, but sometimes a difficulty with finding the structure to work just right. And then as he got older, he started getting more and more controlling of what he was doing, and often it lost some of the spontaneity. And somehow this sonata has both virtues of spontaneity and the control in just such beautiful measure. It's you sort of feel he must have been just open-hearted till now when he was writing it. It's funny, I've sort of improvised a lot over the years and tried composing little bits, and the best thing I ever wrote came to me absolutely immediately without any thought, just like a whole little Scottish tune basically, and it's nothing elaborate, but just it has real feeling in it. And you sort of sense with this Brahms, like, I feel like there was a fair amount of that, just somehow natural realization of, oh, that's beautiful, and not having to slave away, is my guess. I might be completely wrong, but what do you think?
Well, I know he wrote it just very briefly in the summertime, so I'm sure the first movement, that to me feels like it flowed out of him very quickly. But David was mentioning that Brahms probably wrote many more sonatas. Brahms edited, and by edited I mean he burned many of his earlier sonatas that he thought were not up to the level of his mature composing.
And so his Opus 1 is a piano sonata which quotes Beethoven's Hammer Clavier Sonata. So like he starts with this incredible ambition.
Yeah, absolutely. That piece is amazing because even it has like almost like a colored recapitulation with the where it doesn't come back into a C. He's already experimenting with structural differences there. I think where he has B flats or something like that. But no, it's amazing stuff. The one thing that I think he achieves that spontaneity, but one of the things about it that also links to the Franck that you play later is the use of a recurring motive that comes back, and especially the dotted one that's so prevalent there in the first movement, and then is of course important in the final movement in particular. But there seems to be an element of in this sense there's a through line between this idea of thematic transformation, even if it's motivic transformation or something like that across these pieces. And that's also something I was shared with the Franck. I don't know if that was part of one of the connections that you were thinking of with them, or just
not for me. He might have been the genius.
Well, I just made that up, so you can forget. Well, anyway, it's a wonderful sonata, and he only published 3, right? So but to me, this has always been one of my favorites. It's an amazing piece. The next, on the second half of the program, we have 2 pieces by Lili Boulanger. And maybe you can say, you've already mentioned a little bit about kind of this tradition that's related to Franck, but maybe you can just say a little bit more about what drew you to these 2 pieces.
Lili Boulanger was a French composer who unfortunately died far, far too young. I want to say in her mid-20s. But she wrote these pieces in her late teens, I think 19 and 21. They weren't originally designed as a set, but because unfortunately we don't have enough of her music, they're now kind of played together. She was an incredibly talented composer. I mean, you'll hear the first movement has this very typical French impressionist element to it, where the orchestration, even across 2 instruments, is just so potent and so colorful. I think she was one of the youngest Prix de Rome winners, I believe. So the Prix de Rome was a big composition prize. I think it still exists, actually. She, like Clara, didn't get a chance to write quite as much music as I think they deserved. And so these 2 pieces are kind of all we have surviving for violin and piano from Lili Boulanger. As a side note, her sister, Nadia, was a famous composition teacher in France who I believe George Gershwin went to for a lesson once, and apparently she turned him away, and she says, Mr. Gershwin, I'm sorry, I have nothing to teach you. You are fully formed. Yeah. But Nadia...
She made Carter work at it, though.
Nadia was a huge protector but also supporter of her sister's music. And so I think it's because of Nadia that we have these two pieces coupled.
Well, that's wonderful. We the library has some materials related to, not to these pieces, unfortunately, but related to especially Nadia Boulanger, but also Lili as well, and the kind of the legacy that was maintained through the 20th century and beyond, really. I mean, a lot of these teachers, Nadia's role as a pedagogue was huge for a lot of the composers the American composers who are represented in our collections. So definitely, if that's of interest to you, as we're talking to us about and coming out and checking out the collections, but I always have to put in a pitch for the concert ends with the Franck sonata, and this is I find this to be a fascinating piece because it's an element. There's an element of the Germanic sonata tradition, but it's also this French thing that's not quite in the direction that Debussy and others would take it, but kind of it's a sort of a third way between the two. But at least that's my impression of it. But maybe before we just dive into that, you could say just a bit about the relationship between your violin and this particular piece.
Sure. So César Franck, great Franco-Belgian composer. Early in the early middle part of his career, he was not quite as well known as he probably deserved to be, and it was because of Eugène Ysaÿe, the Belgian virtuoso who played on my violin, that he became more well known. Ysaÿe would host these kind of clubs, these evenings, these soirees where he would basically premiere a bunch of music, sometimes by Debussy, sometimes by Ravel, Delibes, names that we're now familiar with, but at the time, were a little fresh. So Franck was very much indebted to Ysaÿe. He wrote several pieces for him. There was a concerto of sorts for violin, piano, and string quartet. He wrote a piece for violin and orchestra called Poème. But when he heard that Mr. Ysaÿe was going to get married, he wanted to send him a gift. And that gift was this sonata. And so just imagine how insane this must be. Ysaÿe received the draft of the sonata the morning of his wedding. And he said to himself, I've got nothing better to do. I might as well learn this sonata. And you know what? How about I play it tomorrow as part of the festivities? So he learned this piece. His vowels must have been horrible. I don't know. But
it's the pianist I feel sorry for.
Also, yeah. And then he gave a premiere, I think, of maybe 2 movements or something the next day. Supposedly, subsequently, at the kind of official premiere of this sonata, it was held at a museum in Paris that didn't have electricity at the time, and it was candlelit. And supposedly, by I think halfway through the second movement, both he and the pianist were playing from memory. Which, I mean, you'll hear just how terrifying that must have been as well. So the connection to my violin, the piece was not premiered on my instrument per se. I think Mr. Ysaÿe came to this violin in the early 1900s, and the sonata was a gift in the late 1800s. But this you'll hear, it's a perfect encapsulation of color, of form, of virtuosity for both instruments. Ysaÿe fell in love with the piece and championed it all over the world. And so I feel that the sound that Ysaÿe has played into the violin and that is suited for this kind of instrument is very much associated with the sonata itself.
That's amazing. It's such an amazing story. And one of those things that you can kind of believe, it's so absurd that you can believe it. But, well, that's wonderful. I mean, so the piece, the second movement is quite treacherous. I would imagine if you didn't have lighting, that would make it even more so. But the balance of the piece, this is again just the one, not to belabor it, but the idea of having some material that is referenced in different movements again and again in a different way was something that Franck was famous for with the symphony and other pieces like that. But it was also something that Schubert had done, and it has a long tradition itself. How do you handle the balance of the piece? It's funny. I don't want to call it top heavy, but there's a little bit of that element of like the way that it goes into that second movement, but it still feels right at the end. But I'm curious just what your feelings are about your experience.
It is funny. It does feel like it ends slightly quickly. Like the coda in the last movement comes almost perfunctorily. It sort of just you were get to A major, and then okay, chord does an A major, and that's a bit hard to express. But so that, I mean, it's a really fabulous piece, and so you just sort of try and think, well, actually, maybe the complications are gone. So I mean, apparently, it tells the story of a relationship. The first movement is falling in love. Is that right? Second movement's arguments, something like that. Third movement is regret, and the fourth movement so basically has wedding bells, like but it's a fabulous piece anyway. But when you have this kind of very simple kind of story as an overview, it's just, I don't know, it's wonderful. And the arguments movement, that's really fun when you really let loose on that.
Yeah, you don't need to understand or feel the structure, but I'm struck by how clean each movement is. I mean, like the first movement is as by the book sort of sonata form as one can imagine. It starts with an idea, it departs from that idea, it returns home, and then it kind of transforms it in a very short way at the very end. That's sonata form right there. Four movements was typical of kind of more Baroque sonatas. The French and Belgian composers of the time were looking for a new way of establishing their own sort of national identity through music. And I think a lot of them turned to Lili and these Baroque composers for inspiration. So Franck was kind of that perfect bridge between charting a new way forward of composition that was not Wagnerian. It didn't have leitmotifs. It wasn't, big Wagner tubas and stuff like that. It was incredibly colorful. It was romantic and passionate while still being distinctively French.
Well said. Well, that's the concert, which you're going to hear momentarily. So I think we'll just let the rest be kind of up for mystery. But and you'll be excited to hear. Is everybody familiar with these pieces, or have you heard anybody who's heard the Franck before? Okay, but they're good. Some people haven't. This is great. You're in for a real treat for all of these pieces, really. And so I'm curious before we end, just to talk a little bit about what you're up to now. Otherwise, other than this concert, like what else do you have on your mind? Because you recording projects, things like that you might want to share.
You just released an album, right?
With my wife, who's a clarinetist, Jean Johnson. We just released our second album with actually everything linked to Brahms, funnily enough. Again, clarinet sonata by Gustav Jenner, who was Brahms's only long-term pupil, and the same Clara Schumann romances on clarinet. We stole them. And Robert Schumann romances and Weber Grand Duo, which gives all of our fingers a good workout.
I'm in the middle of a wonderfly hectic and busy period. I actually also I recorded an album in mid-January, and since then I've been kind of on the road. I was just in Dresden playing some Mozart. From here, I'll be playing Britten Concerto in Nashville this weekend, Beethoven Concerto on Tuesday night in Scottsdale, Arizona with a festival orchestra. And then I return to Mozart in Sarasota, Florida next weekend.
Which Mozart?
The fifth one, the Turkish. Yeah.
That's what we have at the library. Did you know that?
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that. Oh my gosh. Okay. I got to check that out.
Yeah, next time we'll have to.
What's on your album?
Forgive me. I recorded the Franck with another pianist. Steven is obviously, you'll hear he's an exceptional pianist. He's also very hard to get dates in because he's so sought after. So it's a recreation of a recital that I did in November with Gloria Chen. So there's some Izai for the violin, obviously, some Bartók, some Szymanowski, a new work by a dear friend of mine, Chris Rogerson, and then the Franck. So there's always room for a second recording of this.
Well, this is wonderful. I mean, I should also mention that I've known Steven's recordings for many, many years. You've got something like 37 or so albums with Hyperion, which is a great British label, and there's just a wide variety of things that you should check out, and both players are amazing. So I'm really looking forward to this. So just join me and thank you. If you want to get something else that you'd like to,
I'm just curious if anyone has questions. Always happy. Sure. Immediately, a couple of hands up.
You've told us so much about, you've titillated our interest about your instrument. How did it come to you?
Great question. I have been fortunate to have this violin on loan from a foundation in Japan, formerly called the Nippon Music Foundation. They just changed their name to the Sasakawa Music Foundation. They are an incredible organization where, you, as a violinist, you can apply. You send in an application, you send in your concert listings, a few recordings and videos, and they have a selection process. I think in their collection they have something like close to 20 Stradivarius and Guarneri instruments. So it's a long story, but I previously had a Stradivarius on loan. COVID came. We all returned the instruments to Japan for safekeeping. Coming out of COVID, when we could go retrieve them, they basically said to me, you can have your old violin back, or we now have this violin available. And so, I basically said if Mr. Izai thought it was worthy, after Mr. Izai, there was Yehudi Menuhin also played on the violin, Isaac Stern, Tinka Zucker. I mean, the list goes on of great violinists who have said, this is the violin that I want to play on. So I said, I'll take that one.
Good question. Do we have another? I think I'll just wait for the microphone. Yeah.
We learned a lot about the pedagogical lineage of Brahms and Franck and Boulanger. I'm curious about your own pedagogical lineage, who your teachers were, and if you can trace that back.
Yeah. Should I go first? I do actually have a direct link to Izai as a teacher. Izai, well, I'll start with me. So my teachers, I studied at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia for my sort of undergrad degrees. I was studying with Pamela Frank and Ida Kavafian. After that, I went to Germany to study with Christian Tetzlaff. I now actually serve on the faculty of Curtis, so I get to kind of be an extra link to the next generation. But yeah, that lineage goes back from, I believe Ida Kavafian studied with Oskar Shumsky and a little bit with Ivan Galamian. And that link goes back directly to Izai. And then I'm sure from Izai, we can probably go back to Paganini and whatever, but yeah.
My longest standing teacher was Irena Calloway, who studied with Clara Haskell for a while. Actually, almost all piano students somehow go back to Liszt in some way or another. Liszt taught an awful lot of people, so I think there's a link there somewhere. I also had a few lessons from Charles Rosen, who was an amazing teacher. It's very interesting, but when you interacted with him one-to-one, he just talked at you constantly. But when he taught, he didn't have very much to say, and the things he said were extremely pertinent. He said the best thing I ever heard about interpretation, which is when nothing's happening, don't do anything.
So, go ahead.
Yes, I'm very much interested to hear how carefully you selected the program and decided which pieces would connect with each other and in what order. But I'm also very interested to find out a little bit more about how the two of you found each other, because it's obvious that even though each of you is extremely busy, it's not as though, oh, well, I need somebody, this person happens to be here, sit down and let's see what we can do. It's obvious you talked about it and you discussed, and each of you had a hand in saying, well, I think we should do this and I think we should do that. So have you performed together before? And what brings you together?
If I may,
and keeps you together.
Gosh away.
Yeah. I played with many pianists as partners over my career, and I've loved working with many of them for different reasons. But for several reasons, something hasn't worked out. Either a pianist gets injured, or a dear friend of mine is absolutely horrible with visa applications and therefore misses concerts and things like that. And so I hadn't until I met Steven really found a partner that felt kind of like the perfect match. And I knew Steven's playing from his recordings, of course, but I heard him, was it 3 summers ago in Seattle? We were both at a chamber music festival in Seattle, and we didn't perform together at that festival. We were on the same concerts, and I was struck by a performance that Steven gave of the Ravel piano trio. It's got a fiendishly difficult piano part that has to be, it's like dancing on nails. I mean, I don't know how you describe it, but it's you have so many technical challenges yourself. And then on top of that, I was struck by, he was performing with 2 world-class artists who I will not name, who could not be more different in their understanding of the piece. I mean, it really felt like oil and water. I mean, there was no mixing whatsoever, but somehow Steven was this perfect mediator between them where he made everything make sense. And to me, that was the mark of a great artist who had that flexibility, had the conviction of being able to be themselves while also being supremely aware of what could go wrong around them.
Well, and so I heard Ben played with my wife at that same festival, Bartok Contrast, and I was just so struck by simply the phenomenal instrumentalism, but also just it was clear he meant everything he did. And it's funny, it's not so often that I listen to musicians when I get that very direct sense of connection to what they're doing. I mean, there's lots of wonderful musicians around, but of course taste is a very slippery thing, you know. I've been on a number of competition juries, and when you are allowed to discuss competitors when they get voted out, you're just horrified by what other people think. You just can't believe they could possibly have liked that person, they hated that person. But so when I heard Ben play it just felt like I really relate to this. And so that very near the end of the week, I plucked up the courage and asked him if he fancied doing something together. He said, "Oh, actually, I was wondering the same thing." So thank you for not rejecting me, Ben.
We still have some explaining to do about the recording, but I think we might have time for one or two more if we have any other questions. Does anybody have we have one up here. Here.
Yeah.
Just today I read Steven's really lovely essay about Keith Jarrett and how he was influenced and really listened to him early in his career, and the fact that you're doing more improvisations. So if you could talk a little bit about that, and if Ben has any words about improvisation, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I mean, it's really about what musical communication is about, is what I really got from Jarrett. There's something that's been very unhelpful in classical music education for decades. I think it's gradually improving, but there was this very rigid view that you had to do exactly what's written in the score. That's your job. And if you're lucky, you get to express a bit as well. I heard a conductor, a very famous conductor, say, my job is to reproduce a score and maybe 10% I can add my own feelings. And I just found this really horrifying, because that's a kind of orthodoxy. Your job is to serve the composer. What does that mean? It's actually a nonsense. I mean, get a MIDI file to play program in all the details in the score. There's very little in the score, actually. There's no feeling in the score whatsoever. So, as a preface, when Jarrett's playing, firstly, he's just supremely communicative, and secondly, Jarrett, for those of you who don't know, would play these concerts that were completely unplanned. He's a jazz pianist, but he had a lot of background in classical as well. He would sit down at the piano, no idea what he was going to play, and then play for 45 minutes. And there are always moments in those concerts where you can tell he's recycling the same thing, kind of searching for what might come next. And then they're kind of boring bits. And then he'll sort of find something and it'll really come to life. And then, so you'll get this ebb and flow of intensity. Sometimes, like, the intensity is there immediately and just continues. Vienna Concert, for me, is my favorite. If you don't know Keith Jarrett's playing, listen to Vienna Concert, the album's called. It just... it's the antidote to this rigidity in teaching, because it's this sense that you're just so deeply involved, like moment to moment, like you're inside the music. You're not trying to recreate the music. You are somehow creating it yourself. So improvisation really helped me when I'm playing classical stuff to get closer to that sense. A lot of the improvisation was a huge influence in classical music, like Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, even Brahms improvised himself as well. I mean, there's so much of classical music that's unthinkable without improvisation there in the background. And if you feel like it's all kind of set in stone, you miss the drama of it. So, yeah, Keith Jarrett and Alfred Brendel, those were the two biggest influences on me. Brendel for how he characterized music, and Jarrett for this sense of openness and how music flows.
Steven has asked gently if for a next recital program if I might consider improvising, and I'm yet to commit to that. I aim for the exact same destination as Steven, but I find my way of getting total freedom is through repetition, and so the idea of improvising is not, to me, a freeing exercise just yet.
It's just very interesting. Like, if you sit down when there's nothing happening, what wants to come into the silence? It's a completely different way of relating to music than knowing what the first note is. Like an author sitting down with this blank page, what's the first word? It's a very, I don't know. Just you feel in your body somehow. This kind of excitement can come. Oh, this could come. It's wonderful.
Well, I'd like to thank our audience for these great questions. They really added a lot. I really appreciate it. But I think we should let our performers get ready for the concert. And so please join me in thanking